as the land of the free struggles to live up to its name, and public opinion equates Muslims with terrorism,
Islam is of the devil.
and the Islamic world reacts with outrage. 9 years after 9/11, the United States is still mired in conflict across the Islamic world.
We still have hundreds of thousands of American troops in Muslim land.
We ask, what future for Muslims in America,
Let there be no doubt, Islam is a part of America.
and what prospects for America in the Islamic world? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. The mounting tensions between the US and Islam are rooted in the post-Cold War attempts to map the emerging world order, delineate its fault lines, and show why and how the US and the West must prevail. The intellectual generals of US Western establishment, from Bernard Lewis, author of The Origin of Islamic Rage, to Francis Fukuyama, End of History, through V.S. Naipaul, The Western Civilization, and Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilization, among others, laid the vision for the new era. The tragic 1993, and more importantly, the 2001 attacks here in New York, helped reduce these mostly discredited theories into a simplistic but dangerous US clash with Islam and escalated US efforts to dominate and transform the greater Middle East region. Enter the war on terror, which tried to equate Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, or so-called Islamofascism, with the threat of communism. The election of Barack Obama as the first minority US president with Islamic roots and sensitivities raised hopes that he would improve America's relations with the Islamic world on the basis of mutual interest and mutual respect. But the audacity of hope has recently been eclipsed by the reality of war and the politics of fear, polarizing America and confusing the rest of the world. Will the real America please stand up?
We'll put a boot in your ass. It's the American way. Hey, Uncle Sam, put your
Is it this,
top of his list and a
an angry and vengeful nation? Or this, the first black president with a neat line in honeyed words?
As a citizen and as president, I believe that Muslims have the right to practice their religion as everyone else in this country.
When President Obama was elected, people were very open to have a better image of America in the Muslim world. Unfortunately, in the time since his inauguration, we've seen a lot of nice rhetoric, but actions have not matched up to the rhetoric.
The result? Opinion polls across the Islamic world show that 80% of Muslims now look on the United States as their enemy.
We don't live under Islamic supremacist rule, at least not yet.
While a disturbing number of Americans now fear Muslims living amongst them and equate Islam with terrorism.
About 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 Americans has an actively hostile stance towards Islam and Muslims.
Which is odd, given that the FBI's own detailed statistical analysis of terrorist attacks inside the United States show Islamic extremists in 4th place, responsible for less than 20 of the 318 incidents recorded between 1980 and 2005.
Most Muslims right across the Muslim world are very concerned about how America views Islam. And they had the impression, rightly or wrongly, that America does not like Islam and is even involved in a fight, in a battle against Islam.
The extreme opposition to a very modest proposal for a distinctly non-extreme cultural center quite some distance from ground zero brought the simmering intolerance front and center.
We'd be quite happy to have a mosque built near the World Trade Center the morning that one church and one synagogue are opened in Mecca.
At the same time, attacks on mosques and those who attend them are becoming more frequent. While in the shadow of the so-called sacred ground, Muslim taxi driver in New York was last month stabbed in the neck for being Muslim.
It just seems when things happen to Muslims, you don't take as much notice. There was a bombing at a mosque in Florida in May. Not one national media outlet picked it up. Can you imagine if it had been a Muslim attacking a church or a synagogue in Florida? Would have been international headlines for weeks.
No matter how many presidents say it,
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith.
Let there be no doubt, Islam is a part of America.
hostility to Muslims and Islam now seems to be burned into the United States' very DNA.
The irony is that the Muslim community, unlike other immigrant groups arriving in America, were accepted because the immigrants arriving from the Middle East and South Asia in the 80s and 90s in the last century went under the radar. There wasn't a big fuss about them until 9/11, when America suddenly awoke and said, who are our neighbors? Who are these Muslims?
Which was exactly what the 9/11 terrorists had hoped for.
I think bin Laden is probably, if he's alive and if he's able to follow world events, probably overjoyed, because what has happened is way beyond his expectations.
We say no!
So while America vilifies even its most peaceful Muslim citizens for wanting to be both American and Muslim, Washington simultaneously claims the right to enforce American hegemony in Muslim lands across the planet.
Almost a decade after 9/11, we still have hundreds of thousands of American troops in Muslim lands. We still have Muslims wanting to attack America. We have a lot of hatred, and we have this rhetoric of hatred which seems to be rising. It's not going down.
And I'm also proud to carry with me the goodwill of the American people and a greeting of peace from Muslim communities in my country.
Whatever Obama may say, if Muslims see themselves under attack in America and throughout the Islamic world, is it surprising that they distrust the leader of a country who promises them peace,
Assalamu alaikum,
but is yet to deliver? Joining me to discuss the future of U.S.-Muslim relations are renowned journalist and war correspondent Christopher Hedges, author of numerous books, including Empire of Illusion and War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Richard Bullitt, professor of history at Columbia University, the author of The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, as well as Islam, The View from the Edge. And last, of course not least, Zachary Lockman, professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, and author of Contending Visions of the Middle East, The History and Politics of Orientalism. Gentlemen, welcome to Empire.
Thank you.
Let me start from the top and ask you, are the United States and the Islamic world on a collision course? Chris, you start us.
Yes, and they have been since 9/11, when the United States, in terms of its own self-exaltation and self-absorption, has cut itself off from the reality of world politics.
I think that that's too broad a statement. I think that the Islamic world is not a single entity, and I think connecting it with the end of the Cold War, 9/11, also unsettles me as a historian, because I think we have to go back to the Iranian Revolution of '79 and perhaps back to the oil crisis of '73.
We're certainly in a very dangerous moment. I think that we can all agree on. There have been ups and downs over the last decade or so. Ironically, things have taken a turn for the worse since the beginning of the Obama administration. We heard some very positive and at the time apparently hopeful rhetoric from President Obama in Cairo, and what seemed like the portents of a new policy. But in fact, the policy has changed very little, and there's been a rising tide of Islamophobia in this country. And of course, America's wars, big and small, of course, there's Iraq and there's Afghanistan, but of course Pakistan and many other small-scale interventions have raised the temperature a great deal throughout the Muslim world in terms of resentment, anger, unhappiness with the United States and its policies.
Chris, you mentioned 9/11. Richard, you mentioned the Iranian revolutions. I mentioned the end of the Cold War. Of course, other people trace it back to the times when the Islamic Khaliffates began in the 6th and the 7th hundred year. through the Crusades onto the Ottoman Empire through the colonial era. And that none of this is new. And in fact, Richard, Islam and the West have been on a collision course for centuries.
Well, I think that there has been a collision course and there's been a convergent course. I mean, you can have two things coming together and they don't necessarily hit each other. And I think that in many instances, Islam has been a contributor to the culture of the West and vice versa without a conflict. And other times there have clearly been conflicts. But when we generalize at the level of Islam and the West, the details get lost. For many Muslims prior to 9/11, one of the big sins of the United States was not that they were going to war against Muslims, but that they were supporting dictatorial governments in Muslim countries, in Egypt or in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia, places like that, that the opposition wasn't seen as a clash in a warlike sense, but rather as a sort of a conspiracy of Muslim dictators and American policies.
Yeah, but since the first Gulf War, there has been a physical reconfiguration of the Middle East by American military forces occupying posts throughout the region, including, of course, two countries, waging war by proxy, whether it's against Yemen, Pakistan, and that is a major and dramatic change. I was in the Middle East pre-First Gulf War, during the First Gulf War, and afterwards, and I watched it. And I think that much of the anger in the Middle East boils down to the simple fact that the Muslim world does not want to be occupied, and they are occupied.
So you think we're going beyond the so-called U.S. support for Israel and a bit of Iranian hatred because of the U.S. intervention and support for the Shah in the 70s into quantitatively and qualitatively different relationship, asymmetrical relationship?
Without question. And I say that as somebody who reported and watched that entire military adventurism take off.
But that was before 9/11.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, this is the question: is when does this transformation take place? You go to the first Gulf War, that coincides with the fall of the Soviet Union, and that fits the
right. But the two transformations are: you have the one transformation in the Middle East with the expansion of military power, and then you have the second element coming into play after 9/11, which is the demonization of Muslims internally. Mm-hmm. And these two have become the two fuses which are propelling us, have already propelled us, I think, towards a very frightening clash with much of the Islamic world.
Zaki, you tried to nuance it between dictators and the people, but aren't all today under American hegemony?
Well, certainly the United States is the only superpower, and it's the United States which plays the dominant political, military, economic role in certainly the Middle East and in much of the Muslim world. But there we have to disaggregate a little bit, following up on what Dick suggested. The United States has been closely aligned with and has propped up ruling groups in many Muslim countries, much to the discontent and unhappiness of their populations. It's the United States that has helped keep the Saudi ruling family in power going back to the end of the Second World War, and props up the authoritarian regime in Egypt, and has propped up the generals and a very corrupt feudalistic ruling class in Pakistan, something we've seen graphically demonstrated in recent weeks in terms of the aftermath of the devastating floods. So there are alliances on political grounds between the United States and its clients and allies in many parts of the Muslim world, purely about power politics. On neither side is culture all that crucial. There are also many millions, hundreds of millions of Muslims who would love to send their children to university in the United States.
And there lays the paradox, I suppose.
There's a paradox there. There's, in some sense, a tremendous desire to have good relations with the United States and understanding of American power and a certain attractiveness of American culture on the one hand, and yet in America that from the perspective of many Muslims doesn't live up to its professed ideals, in fact is incredibly hypocritical.
So you argue they don't exactly hate America for what it stands for and for its way of life?
I think it has, there are groups which definitely hate its way of life and what it stands for, there's no question about it. But I think for the great majority of Muslims, it's about being at the receiving end of American power. It's about what the United States does as opposed to what it says.
And let's remember that most of these societies are in essence oligarchic societies, and when you talk about people who want to send their children to elite universities, we're talking about a hated oligarchic elite.
Already?
Yes.
Back there.
So that the anger that comes off of the street, having lived in places like Egypt, is an anger not only directed towards America, but an Americanized oligarchic elite that has thwarted the aspirations of poor Egyptians, poor Syrians, on and on.
But Chris, if I understand correctly, probably the most articulated anti-Americanism today in the Islamic world is from the educated middle classes and upper classes. I mean, this is where the Osama bin Ladens of the world have come from.
Yes, there were tremendous struggles of identity that found a kind of surety or certitude in radical Islam. And so you're right that many of the leaders, and if you look at sort of statistically, even suicide bombers, often come out of the middle class. I think what we're seeing, and you see why these people are so easily recruited in places like France. 5 million North African Muslims living in France. They may even have been born in Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco, but they go back and they don't fit in France. They don't fit in there.
So they're the ones who are living on the periphery, on the fault line between the West and the East.
Yes, and they're the ones most easily recruited into these movements. So you're right that it comes out of the middle class, but I think that what these movements play to is precisely that confusion of identity, which is very hard to negotiate if you are a highly educated, relatively well-off Muslim who has a kind of discourse both with the Muslim world and Western culture.
Yeah, but this analysis wouldn't work for Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mean, there's little indication that it's the educated, politicized middle class or elite that are moving into the movements, but rather they're recruiting from a much lower social stratum, particularly educated in a more traditional fashion.
And it wouldn't work as well for Gaza. I'm very acutely aware of that.
Those middle classes, they're the ones who are probably most conscious, Zachary, of American intervention. That the West, the United States in particular, has been quite supportive of Islamists, probably Islamists on the right, throughout the last century and more, against the nationalists and the so-called leftists and so on in the Arab and the Muslim world.
Certainly in the period of the Cold War, the United States saw at least some Islamist elements as potential allies in the struggle against communism, in the struggle against Soviet influence, in the struggle against radical nationalists who were largely secularist in the 1950s, 60s, and 1970s. It's sort of like the Israelis initially supporting or tolerating the Muslim Brothers in Gaza, who then eventually evolve into Hamas, simply because they were seen as a counterweight to the secular nationalist Palestine Liberation Organization and its constituent groups. So there's a history here, and it took the United States some time. It was really only in the 80s, really the 90s, when the United States began to identify what it saw as the Islamic threat. And many of these groups became much more explicitly political and much more explicitly anti-American, came to see the United States as the main danger. But we live in a country which suffers from historical amnesia.
Yeah, but it's not just amnesia. I think that we ignored Islam. Between the end of World War II and the Iranian Revolution in 1979, I can only think of 3 books written by American-trained scholars that talked about contemporary Islam. Islam was systematically
absent.
It was absent because we were obsessed with modernization theory that dictated that religion was going to cease to be important in the world. There was a willful ignorance of Islam, and therefore notions of supporting Islam were very vaguely predicated on basically on what was Christianity like in Europe or something like that, because nobody really knew what Islam was like.
Suddenly, as the society here is polarized on the question of how to deal best with the Islamic world, and as the war fails to achieve American objectives, everyone now is speaking about how the West is going to reform Islam. I have the sense, Chris, that this is even more dangerous than war when you start telling Muslims how to pray and how to dress.
Here you don't want to start using words like the Islamic world. I agree with you. I mean, having lived 7 years in the Middle East, and you know this as well as I do, Marwan, you know, a Sudanese is not an Iraqi. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia. A Bosnian Muslim has far more in common with a Bosnian Serb, culturally, linguistically, in terms of his or her orientation, than he does or she does with a Tunisian. And so you're very right, because then to use these kind of global terms of the Islamic world and reforming Islam and what Muslims understand or don't understand. I mean, the kind of rhetoric that all of us appall, I'm sure all of us here, this cartoonish vision of what it means to be a Muslim, it doesn't work. Because the reality is religious dogma plays a very minor part in terms of forming national characteristics and outlooks. It has far more to do with geography, economic level, education, and this is just an unassailable fact. The difference between, I mean, it's as if you were to say a Bolivian Catholic is the same as a French Catholic because they're Catholic. And the same absurdity occurs with 1/5 of the world's population that is Muslim. And this is what's so, I think, disturbing to those of us who are conversant with the Middle East, because we hear, in essence, what can only be described as racist terms delivered by people who know nothing about the Muslim world to characterize.
It's also worth noting, Marwan, that some of this goes back a very long way. You can easily find writing from the late 19th century where British and French scholars and policymakers are saying pretty much the same things. They're the good Muslims who will support our projects, who will support our colonial rule, and then they're the bad Muslims who we have to, of course, fight and defeat or divide. Sometimes they pick the same people. We've heard a lot about the good Sufis versus the bad fundamentalists.
Now the Sufis are up on the top of the agenda.
Yes, the Sufis have gotten a lot of attention in recent months. They're the good guys. And in general, you get a playing of these same themes over the last 10 years. They're the good Muslims, right, who are good because they're on our side politically. So the fact that the Saudis, who are in another mirror seen as hardline and promoting all these terrible things, should not be seen as good, but they're our allies, so they're sort of good.
Another paradox.
And then the bad Muslims who are lumped together, even if some of them are Shia Iranians and some of them are all sorts of different things.
And of course, some of the most militant movements against imperialism were Sufis.
As well.
But
now Abdul Rauf, the Imam Abdul Rauf down at Ground Zero is being defended as the Sufi and hence very much close to Western ideals.
Yes, well, it shows, I think, or it's an illustration of a very long-standing ignorance and misconception and misperception, right? We're a society which historically hasn't been all that interested in the rest of the world and hasn't had to be.
But Richard, if I may, you're familiar with perhaps some of this that's going on. And as if we have to choose between hard power, meaning military interventions and secret wars and so on and so forth, drones and what have you, or the softer power approach, apparently, which means that the Americans or the Europeans will have the right to interfere in how people dress, in how people pray, or how people organize their societies in the Muslim world. First of all, do they have the right? And second, do they have the capacity to do that?
They certainly don't have the right, and they don't have the capacity. What is happening, rather, is that you have, I think, sort of cherry picking going on to try and find, let's see the good things in Islam and give them an emphasis. So somebody writes a book that is very benign, and so they say, well, this is a good moderate Muslim. Book's written in English, it's read by Americans, it isn't translated in Arabic, it's there and it gets praised. Someone else writes a book saying, I used to be a Muslim, now I have converted away from Islam, Islam is of the devil, and so forth. And that book will be publicized by another stratum of the press. The illusion we have is that we in the English-speaking world actually are terribly relevant to the millions of Muslims who live in other countries and who are much more interested in what is written in Arabic or Persian or Urdu or Bahasa Indonesia than what happens to be published in the United States.
There's a lot of controversy about how America itself is behaving towards its own Muslim community, but we're going to discuss that after we come back from a short news break. Welcome back. Various media outlets have continued to demonize Muslims and Islam over the last decade, even when Americans were bleeding financially and dying in their thousands to, in their words, save and free Muslims of the greater Middle East from dictators and extremists. The portrayal of Islamism as the new global evil facing America helped Washington and its military establishment to wage a worldwide campaign using all of America's military, financial, and institutional assets. Before we discuss with my guest the danger of focusing on Islam and Islamism as America's #1 enemy and its ramification on U.S. relations with its own Muslim minority, Tim Tate reviews U.S. media coverage of Islam.
It's a long way from this to this.
As a young boy in Indonesia, he was educated in a madrasa, a Muslim religious school.
The number of people who think he's a Muslim has actually gone up.
I can't trust Obama. He's an Arab.
Or is it?
There is a sense that there is a war against Islam, and the media are implicated in this.
There is an enormous amount of stereotyping and fundamental anti-Arab racism or anti-Muslim sentiment.
Islam is of the devil.
In today's 24-hour multimedia onslaught,
Excuse me, but it's a Judeo-Christian nation. Whether you like it or not, that's a fact.
Islam and its followers are portrayed as outsiders, seeking to undermine the American way. In the depths of the Cold War, America embarked on a communist witch hunt, and the media began to see reds under every wholesome American bed. But 10 years before the collapse of communism left the United States as the world's sole superpower, American television audiences became transfixed on a new enemy.
After the Iran hostage crisis, which was covered nightly in the American news, where people felt so helpless against these hostages being taken, there is an enormous amount of stereotyping of wild-eyed terrorists from the Middle East who need to be shot down by Americans.
To much of the American media, 9/11 brought their worst Middle Eastern nightmares home.
Reason is literally thrown out of the window because people begin to see just the threat, the violence, the terror. Those people who try to explain the possible causes that may have had their sources in America were pushed aside. Reasonable voices, reasonable people were sidelined. It was basically bringing in the rebel rousers.
Talk of infidels and jihad in textbooks in America.
It's a Saudi-owned college preparatory school that uses textbooks with passages that extol jihad and martyrdom.
Most of the terrorists we have faced have been Muslim extremists and of Arab descent. That's not an opinion, it is fact.
And as in life, so in art.
You don't understand. These guys are pros. From the age of 12, they've been dodging people like you.
The situation is appalling.
For decades, Hollywood movies have repeatedly associated Muslims with terrorism and depicted America's foreign wars against Islamic extremists as unquestionably righteous.
Have Americans looking over their shoulders.
Good Arabs and bad Arabs. The good Arabs, of course, have to work with the Americans. That's the sign of being a good Arab in Hollywood.
In 2008, 28 million copies of this $400,000 documentary about the perceived threat of radical Islam were given away free of charge with major American newspapers and via direct mail.
Islam is seen as a source of barbarism, irrationalism. So there is this sense that the dam has broken. And the, if you will, the demons of the past are returning.
The media storm over what it christened the Ground Zero Mosque, despite it being neither a mosque nor at Ground Zero, opened up America's airwaves to the nation's Islamic conspiracy theorists.
Today, let's talk about Islamic fundamentalism.
There is this
Well, virus, if you will. A virus that is far more toxic than swine flu.
There is a school of thought that there's a stealthy jihad taking place within the U.S.
It is actually animating people to believe that jihad is what God wants them to engage in.
Hello, America! America's Christian right is playing on the nation's fear and ignorance, waving the shroud of Islamic terrorism as a means to attack the man it hates most in the coming elections.
No government, no king.
The Tea Party basically trying to capitalize on this to ensure that they score maximum points, because this is where the Democrats may be fairly vulnerable. This is where President Obama is vulnerable.
And with the latest opinion poll showing that 24%, nearly 1 in 4 Americans, now believes that the very definitely Christian President Barack Obama is actually a secret Muslim.
I am a Christian. I'm a devout Christian.
What chance of a reconciliation between Islam and the United States?
Chris, if politics is perception, we're certainly in trouble. But let me share with you some of the figures. Today in America, about half of the population has an unfavorable view of Islam. 2/3 of Americans don't want a community center anywhere close to ground zero. Whose fault is it? The media, the politicians, or are Muslims bringing this on themselves?
No, Muslims are definitely not bringing this on themselves. It is with the collapse of American empire. Let's remember that one of the contributing factors to this is the disenfranchisement of the American working class and the attendant rage that that brings. We are doing what societies that disintegrate do. We are picking out scapegoats. This is a racial hatred. It's not an ideological hatred.
So you think it's part of the general xenophobia in the country? Can we connect New York with, say, Texas and what's going on with the
I don't think that
Mexicans
the level of hatred and the rhetoric that we were seeing would be possible without the internal disintegration that we are seeing within the economy and the political system as well, which has ceased to function, where corporate interests drive all forms of legislation and government work, and the citizenry is disempowered. And that's what makes this so dangerous. It's not simple ignorance, although ignorance is part of it. It's not simple xenophobia, although xenophobia is part of it. It's not simple hubris and imperial power and arrogance, although that is part of it. What makes this incendiary is that the country is internally falling apart.
And scapegoating Muslims.
Yes.
Zachary, speaking of the citizenry in this country, which mostly they think that they are in the Muslim world to save and free Muslims from dictatorship and extremists. So how then do you explain that while dying to save Muslims abroad, there is this tension, sometimes hatred towards Muslims at home?
I'm not sure that many Americans were inspired to support the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan by the desire to save Muslims. That was part of the propaganda line, so to speak. They saw themselves, I think, as going there to save the United States, to protect American interests, and to get vengeance perhaps for 9/11, a range of other kinds of things.
So you think this was all slogans and propaganda?
It was there, it served a certain function, but I don't think really that's what motivated the people who supported these wars, who support America's role.
Specifically those on the right seem to me to have always advanced this idea.
There's always been reservoirs of xenophobia, right, directed against various immigrant groups, various minority groups. Racism against African Americans has very deep and strong roots in American society. Muslims are today the target. It's certainly bound up with the global situation, with America's very painful relationship with much of the rest of the Muslim world. But as Chris says, it's also striking that this is a moment of crisis in the United States. And so high unemployment, a dysfunctional society, a society that's not meeting the needs of a great many people, and of course a situation in which lots of white Americans see themselves becoming a minority. Right. All this comes together in a conjuncture with an African American president and deep polarization to help magnify the crisis.
And let me just add, we're seeing in conjunction with this a huge nativist movement against immigrants, which is rapidly transforming itself into a hatred of Mexicans and Central Americans. So it's not only Muslims within America who are being demonized. What we're talking about is that fear of a shrinking white population, which has been dislocated within their own society, is uneducated, doesn't understand what's happening, filled with rage, and is unfortunately, by these cable talk shows and these proto-fascist figures, being given vulnerable groups to vent their hatred upon.
Especially that Muslims, I think, are less than 1% of the population in this country.
Let me throw in another factor here. In the previous episodes of xenophobia associated with these great economic and social crises, there's always been the capability of sort of turning off the spigot because the guardians of the culture have had the capacity to publish different things or broadcast different things. This is the first time we've had a crisis like this with the internet. There are no gatekeepers, and when we talk about something going viral, what we mean is that it appears and then suddenly it appears every place. And
is this like popularization of ignorance?
It's popularization of ignorance, but it's possible for any idiot to have a transformative impact if they happen to hit a resonant chord. So you look at this mosque crisis. You know, we have processes in New York in order to get permission to build a big building. They went through all that, and there was no outcry. And then suddenly there's an outcry that is overwhelming and galvanizes 2/3 of the population.
You touched on a very important point, because we're also at a moment of a cultural shift between a print-based culture into an image-based culture. And when you lose a print-based culture, you're not just losing print as a medium, you're losing information that is based on verifiable fact. The internet and these cable news outlets have essentially inverted this process, where facts are irrelevant. It plays completely to emotion. And so you're right, that the traditional floodgates that have prevented what in essence is sort of hate talk and propaganda from dominating the culture have withered. And people retreat, both in terms of televised shows and on the internet, into very frightening intellectual ghettos where they reinforce their own prejudices. Facts become irrelevant. They believe whatever they want to believe. And within these internal ghettos, they have two enemies. They have the external enemy, who's defined by the group, and the internal enemy, the person who refuses or perhaps to hate with enough venom, the person who asks uncomfortable questions, has allowed this sort of centrifugal force of hatred and prejudice and bigotry and racism to sweep over the culture, because the normal mechanisms that might have helped slow it or contain it no longer work.
Zachary, it seems that the Ground Zero community center is quite demonstrative of that. So mega mosque on Ground Zero. It's not mega and it's not mosque on its Ground Zero. But you keep on listening and hearing that all over the place. Now, here we have an imam that's supposed to be responsible for this community center near Ground Zero. By his own words, he's been on 6 State Department tours, meaning American State Department tours, in the Muslim world, promoting how Islam coexists and lives and so on in America. Does that sound to you like an extremist project?
But it's not about facts, and it's not really about reality. It's about new means of reaching people and of mobilizing people, and supposedly respectable mainstream politicians seizing on this because it's an issue. It's a way to mobilize people with congressional elections coming up in 2 months or less, to mobilize voters around fear, hatred, anger towards Muslims, the Ground Zero issue, towards immigrants, as Chris very usefully pointed out, and building and fueling the anger that a lot of people, for understandable reasons, feel at this moment, and channeling it in this kind of direction.
So it's not just popularization of ignorance or of disinformation. There is then a very specific campaign by cynical politicians, popular leaders, perhaps on the right, trying to push this sort of an agenda.
It gets traction because of the particular moment that we're in, whereas a couple of months ago or several years ago it didn't get traction. It's striking that how much worse this has gotten since the Obama administration's been in power.
The
Bush administration kept a lid on this.
So what does it mean that such a a defining question, perhaps of the decade, maybe of the century, is being played out by cynical politicians in this country.
That makes it the same as every defining moment in history, perhaps. Whatever. So this is not particularly unusual. But one thing I think we have a hard time realizing is that however vituperative some Islamophobe sounds when we see a clip from a cable news channel or something like that, if you actually go on the internet, things are far more vile.
Right.
They're extraordinarily hate-filled.
And you are one of those who I read an article by in one of those publications where you reviewed every single word that someone like Glenn Beck uttered about Shiism and Ahmadinejad, and I think you basically vilified every single point.
He totally invented. He said, "No, now I may not have this quite right, but I've been studying it for 4 or 5 years, and this is pretty much what it is." And then he proceeded to say things that were absolutely completely wrong, one after another.
And he is one of the more popular programs on one of the more popular networks in America.
But there's a book that's coming out this month that talks about how Islam collectively is the 5th beast of the apocalypse with 7 heads and 10 crowns. The most bizarre things are there. And what it means is that there's a reservoir of hate speech, hate thought, hate lunacy that's available for any opportunistic publicist.
Of course, Muslims are present, and if I look at the polls and at the data out there, the average Muslim is more educated than the average American. I think 29% have a college degree. They are fully integrated, so-called moderate, in this country. So there are examples out there. What is a Muslim like in this country? And yet, they're able to vilify Islam.
Because reality is irrelevant. It's not what's reported. It's when people feel lost, confused, when they don't understand why their house is being foreclosed, when they're going bankrupt because of their medical bills, when they can't find a job, or if they do find a job, it's 28 hours a week at Walmart, so they're still qualifying, they're still below the poverty line and qualifying.
So it's not Goldman Sachs, it has to be the Muslim communities in Islam?
Well, of course, because that's precisely what always happens.
And that's why you think we are on a collision course between the United States and the Muslim world.
We already are in the middle of a collision course in the Muslim world, which we're losing, by the way. I wouldn't call what's happening here a collision course. I would call it a very frightening campaign and demonization of American citizens who happen to be Muslim.
Is Obama calming down the situation with his recent declaration that they should be able to build a community center?
Well, he said positive things about the rights of Muslims to build a mosque or a community center as anyone else would, and Mayor Bloomberg has been very eloquent about it. And I think that's a point worth making. It's a very dangerous moment, but there's a struggle going on, and the outcome remains uncertain.
The only way to blunt this movement is not through dialogue. We're far past that. It is through re-enfranchising the underclass in this country back into the economy. It really comes down to jobs. And if they're not re-enfranchised, they're going to end up venting their rage, frustration, hatred, and confusion on a weak enemy. That's what I worry about.
Gentlemen, on this sobering note, we will have to end, but we did find one oasis in the United States where perhaps gives us all some hope about coexistence between Muslims and Christians, Americans in general. We'll watch that, and I'll come back right after the break with a final thought.
Clayton County, Iowa is as American as apple pie. But at its core, it has a dark secret, a link to an Islamic revolutionary who wanted to overthrow the government.
He fought for freedom, he fought for independence of his country, of his people, and that's why he was admired.
Welcome to El-Qaeda. The town was named in honor of Abd el-Qaeda, a hero who led the Arab resistance against French colonial rule in Algeria way back in the 1840s. The town of 1,465 people is not in the least bit revolutionary, but it is proud of its connections, and they've helped it too.
The fact that the Algerian government did provide us a significant financial contribution after the flood of 2008 puts a whole new meaning to the fact that El-Qaeda is named after the George Washington of Algeria.
The comparison is not so far-fetched. Abd el-Qaeda was a man of peace. He rescued thousands of Christians from slaughter and was praised by President Lincoln for his bravery. Today, this small town believes it has a role in promoting interfaith dialogue. And while some towns might have protests, Al-Qaeda commemorates 9/11 with a yearly peace concert. And in spite of the climate of intolerance and misunderstanding, this town stands as a symbol of hope.
To understand the gravity of the escalating tension and conflict between the US and the Muslim world, one needs to take it to its logical conclusion. Many Americans, and many more Muslims, would perish in vain as their cultural and political fault lines intertwine, worsen, and shift back and forth from east to west and from borders to downtowns. Governments unable to protect their citizens would lose their credibility as religious extremism spreads among Muslim communities around the world and fascism takes root in the US and the West in general. And the security state would continue to flourish amid growing chaos and instability. Islam would survive and even flourish just as it did throughout the rise and fall of many empires, albeit more political and less tolerant. America would lose its superpower and global appeal, and ironically, from his cave or grave, Osama bin Laden would be the ultimate winner. Now picture a different scenario, like President Nixon's strategic trip to communist China in the early 70s. President Obama goes and speaks to the next summit of the Islamic Conference, or the Arab League, about specific ways and means to improve relations with the Islamic world, and commits to end all US wars and interventions and withdraw all US and foreign troops unless otherwise agreed upon with those in the region. Yes, he could, and that's the way it goes. If you have any thoughts on the subject, write to me at empire@aljazeera.net. And thank you for watching.